There's a fundamental relationship here between perceptions of hazards like floods and the operation of settler colonialism. So let's talk about what settler colonialism is. In their 2012 article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, scholars Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang explain that there are multiple forms or modes of colonialism. You're going to learn here about 3 of them. First is external colonialism, which is also called exogenous or exploitation colonialism. External colonialism is the expropriation of fragments of indigenous worlds, animals, plants, and human beings, extracting them in order to transport them to and build the wealth, the privilege, or feed the appetites of the colonizers. In external colonialism, all things native become recast as natural resources. Key to this definition is the exploitation of land, all living things, including indigenous peoples. And all of these things come to be seen as resources. And the goal is to extract wealth and take it back to the colonial nation, to enrich this nation. There's also internal colonialism, which is the biopolitical and geopolitical management of people, land, flora, and fauna within the domestic borders of the imperial nation. And this involves the use of particularized modes of control: prisons, ghettos, minoritizing, schooling, policing, to ensure the ascendancy of a nation and its white elite. Strategies of internal colonialism, such as segregation, divestment, surveillance, and criminalization, are both structural and interpersonal. So, if external colonialism is about extraction and exploitation from the colony to the imperial nation, internal colonialism is about forms of management within the imperial nation. And this operates through structural levels like institutional policies and laws, and as well as interpersonal levels like everyday conversations. Think, for example, about the treatment of enslaved Africans forcibly brought to the United States. And even after slavery was outlawed, a system of white supremacy operates through prisons, ghettos, minoritizing, schooling, policing, and other processes of control. Redlining in Chicago would be one example. Now, these categories of internal and external colonialism are not intended to be exhaustive or mutually exclusive. And, importantly, neither category adequately describes the form of colonialism in the Americas, which is where the system of settler colonialism comes in. Tuck and Yang explain that settler colonialism operates through internal and external colonial modes simultaneously, because there is no spatial separation between the metropole, meaning the imperial power, and the colony. Settler colonialism is different from other forms of colonialism in that settlers come with the intention of making a new home on the land, a homemaking that insists on settler sovereignty over all things in their new domain. So if we break this down, settler colonialism involves external exploitation and internal management simultaneously. Settler colonialism is also unique because settlers come with the intention of establishing a new settler society with its own culture and institutions imposed. Fundamental here is settler control and power over everything in the colony. Land is a big part of this, particularly when we think about hazards and disasters. Let's unpack this relationship between settler colonialism and land. Tuck and Yang explain, within settler colonialism, the most important concern is land, water, air, and subterranean earth, which they call land for shorthand. Land is what is most valuable, contested, required. This is because the settlers make indigenous land their new home and source of capital, and also because the disruption of indigenous relationships to land represents a profound epistemic, ontological, cosmological violence. This violence is not temporally contained in the arrival of the settler, but is reasserted each day of occupation. This is why Patrick Wolfe emphasizes that settler colonialism is a structure and not an event. There's a few points we can tease out here. I'm going to bold each section as I discuss it. So land is seen as the most valuable component of a settler colonial system. Why is this the case? Because settlers seek to take indigenous land and 1, make it their own property, 2, use it to make money, while also attempting to 3, dismantle indigenous relationships with the land as a way to weaken indigenous ways of life. And number 3 is crucial because land is fundamental to indigenous worldviews, ways of being, and ways of knowing. And finally, this violence to indigenous ways of life doesn't stop once the settlers have begun to establish themselves and their society. Instead, this violence continues every day that the settlers occupy the land. So when we discuss settler colonialism in our class, we're going to treat it not as a one-time event, but as an ongoing structure and process. Over the course of this term, we're going to consider how processes of settler colonialism, and in particular, the disruption of indigenous relationships to land, shape what counts as a hazard, how hazards are seen and treated, how communities are organized and built in relation to hazards, and whether a hazard will become a disaster. We started talking about these questions today. We'll also ask how processes of settler colonialism and other processes of social inequality can inform the vulnerability of different groups of people to disasters, and how different groups interpret, respond to, and recover from disasters. At the same time, we will learn how indigenous sovereignty, land rights, and worldviews of interconnectedness can enable different relationships to hazards, disasters, vulnerability, and resilience. As we do this, we are going to get to know indigenous leaders and knowledge keepers who are already doing this work. And we're going to discuss what further work needs to be done.